Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever live in conversation episode of the ISJL Virtual Vacation. My name is Nora Katz. I'm the Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. And I am so thrilled and honored to be here with Marcie Cohen Ferris, who is Professor Emerita of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's the author of Matzo Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South, and The Edible South, The Power of Food and the Making of an American Region. She is also the editor of the forthcoming book, Edible North Carolina, A Journey Across a State of Flavor, which will be published this May, which I'm personally very excited about. And for over 40 years, Marcie has studied, documented, interpreted, exhibited, taught, and written about the South, largely through its foodways, its material culture, and the Southern Jewish experience. We are going to jump right in. I want to let our viewers know that if you have questions or comments for Marcie, please put them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can during our conversation. Marcie, to begin, I'm hoping that you can just talk a bit about your own Southern Jewish story and sort of how you came to the study of Southern Jewish foodways.
Yeah, well, hey, Nora. I'm happy to, and it's so good to be with you today. And it's really always really special for me to talk to another staff member of the Institute for Southern Jewish Life, because, you know, I started there too. And that just means so much to me to see the growth. And I'm just so moved by the incredible scholars and educators like yourself who've come to Mississippi and what y'all are building together. I think it's one of the most exciting programs in American Jewish life across the country. And it's no surprise that it's taking place in the American South and in Jackson, Mississippi. We spent a little time talking the other day about how we both adjusted to living in Jackson, really found incredible community there throughout the state as well. And it's an amazing place to be. I was at least a little bit more from that region. I grew up in the state above in Arkansas, in northeastern Arkansas. So that was my Southern Jewish experience was from a small, you know, not a tiny little town, but a pretty rural county, Mississippi County, which is on the Mississippi River up in the northeast corner of the state. And it's very highly agricultural. When I was a little girl, it was all industrial ag, and it had been for quite a long while. And that was really what actually brought my grandfather, my Russian Jewish grandfather, Samuel Joseph, or Jimmy, as he was called, of course, in Arkansas, Jimmy Cohen, to that region. He came as a young draftsman, civil engineer from New York via Minsk and Belarus, I guess that is. And been thinking about those regions so much today as we engage and watch what's happening with Putin in those regions and our great grandparents and grandparents. But Jimmy came and was a young draftsman for the Wilson family, who were huge, you know, a massive series of plantations and farms in northeastern Arkansas. And he started working for them. And you know, it was at the beginning of the kind of the transition to federal flood control and the, you know, and the increased building of levees. So that's what my you know, my Russian Jewish grandfather did, was really engage large. And then I saw my dad doing the same work, Jerry Cohen, always in flood control and drainage work, because it's one of the most important and fertile agricultural regions, you know, in the world. And so my dad, Jerry, who's passed away now, but my mom is still alive and kicking. She's going to be 96. And Josh and Partial and many folks there know my mom, Huddy Cohen. They met, of course, like on a blind date during World War II, you know, and in Connecticut. So my growing up, my parents have the same Southern Jewish relationship that a lot of folks that we know in the region do, of a mixed marriage of Northern and Southern coming together, even though she came from a conservative leaning towards Orthodox observant community in her little town, New London in Connecticut. And my dad from a very assimilated, almost kind of non-religious family, very Russian socialist background. And but my mom brought them kind of around and together as a young couple and young marrieds, and like Josh Partial, his family were part of, in my family too, we're all members of the same Temple Israel in Blytheville, and so that's our family.
Marcie, I'm curious about, in the beginning of the Edible South, you talk about how after you were away at school, your parents would ask you about, how your day went, and you would always talk about food. And I am also like that. And I'm wondering how you kind of came to the world of foodways and how that has, been a part of your experience in your academic and personal background.
Sure. I do think it goes back to your childhood and probably for you too, Nora, just in the way that you see the world. And I've also noticed that, in my research as well too, even when you look at letters, like 19th century letters, from one Jewish family, a sister to a brother or to a mother, some people will speak of food frequently in their correspondence and others don't. It's just not how they see the world. But in my research, I was always looking for those people that was one lens onto the world. For me as a little kid, it really was. But I think that so much had to do with our Jewish otherness and with our connection to Jewish families also outside the region, to Connecticut. I knew that we ate differently, largely from my non-Jewish community and friends. And from when I was little bitty, it was just really clear, especially with a Connecticut Jewish mom who was preparing, Ashkenazi specialties for holidays. And still she cooked pretty New England style food, in my introduction to really Southern food in our own household was, of course, from an African-American domestic worker named Richie Lee King, who was not a cook, though, for our family, but occasionally my mother would beg and plead and ask Richie if she might make, Shabbat fried chicken. So I learned, there's food that people in Arkansas eat, and then there's food that Jewish people in Arkansas eat. And I knew we had these and the food was different when we went to Connecticut. The Jewish food was different. It was like we'd fly into Providence, Rhode Island or whatever when I was little to get to New London, and it might be winter. I remember winter food really well. And there would be dark pumpernickel. My grandmother would have set out a late snack for us of dark pumpernickel and farmer's cheese and butter and milk. And even though they didn't keep kosher anymore, and stuffed, like she'd make while we were there, stuffed veal, like nobody has that anymore. Or maybe they do, but it's very special. But it was so exotic to me. And I remember my mom, telling us, when she was little, they kept kosher and errant forks and knives and spoons that, that got messed up from fleischig and milk, would, instead of putting it out in the backyard and burying it for 24 hours, my grandma Lena just kept a flower pot of dirt, and just would dunk it down in there, that was good enough, So I just was aware of food always, I think, as a child. And then I went into public history, and it always, and also I was in public history in the in the 70s and the 80s, when food studies, I now realize, was really just starting. Not that it hadn't existed in like anthropological work, you know, in the late 19th century and forward. But as far as in kind of the academy, it was really beginning to be embraced, but still seen, even feminist scholars kind of pushed away from it because they didn't want to be locked in to the domestic space. And eventually that began to loosen up. But I've had the privilege of watching food studies grow as a field, which is absolutely now, but it was always a part of, well, maybe, you know, more comfortably it is now, but it would, you know, you could find food studies or culinary food histories in history, but I studied folklore. American folklore was one of my fields when I was getting my doctorate, and it's very comfortable there and also within social history and anthropology and in geography, you know, and so that's where it connected for me. And when I was doing my doctorate at George Washington University in DC, I decided I really want to look at my folk group. And I had to convince some folks that Southern Jews were a folk group and that they had folk ways and material culture like their food as a language of understanding their experience. And I was so moved and influenced by work of scholars like Jenna Joslet, and loved her work. And of course, I was reading Joan Nathan at the time too, who's a great, you know, food journalist in the Times and published many food books. But Jenna's work, I thought this could be, I want to look at how she understands American Jewish culture within the South in those material ways. I think that helped direct me that way.
I love that. I think this kind of gets to this question, I think, for folks who don't maybe haven't thought about food in this way before, like, why does studying food and food ways matter? Like, what can it tell us as we're learning about a folk group or a community?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I really do see it as another language or cultural expression. And it's far more than kind of recipes, which are like one critical aspect. So, you know, I know you and I have talked about this before. There are these incredible sources for food studies, but it's much more than cookbooks and recipes as well, because it's food ways, FOODWAYS, is really what people eat and why and how. So it's everything, you know, your cultural practices, your identity, your politics, your class, your race, your gender, and then it's how you get your food. Where does it come from? Is it locally sourced? Is it manufactured? Do you grow it? What time and history do you live in the world? But for me, food really took me, I thought it might take me particularly into women's lives that have often been silenced. And I knew it was, and that's powerful to me, because like Josh's grandmother, you know, just a wonderful, wonderful lady, you know, and my grandma and my mother, you know, we're dear friends. And I watched that community of women in the kitchen at Temple Israel, where I grew up, and their agency and that they had in running that synagogue. And it made me understand, you know, the power of food. And then as I began to study food and women in American Jewish life, I studied under Pamela Nadell at when in DC at American University too, and I was so honored, to be able to take her classes in American Jewish women's history. And she helped me also really understand how women have expressed and gotten power within domestic spaces and public spaces as well. And food was a tool. Food is just one tool, for organizing, for resistance, for expressing your politics, for looking like others, to try to lean your identity a particular way. You could eat like other people. And certainly that became something I was really interested in exploring, in the Jewish South. What could it tell us as we look? And I just knew that I had to kind of move through specific moments, kind of maybe critical moments in Southern Jewish history. And how could I know more about those moments through women's experience, through the other members of Jewish households that were not Jewish, particularly African-American women, laborers, cooks, and not just in Jewish homes, but the synagogue, in workplaces. So there was a space of entrepreneurship too related to food that was really important.
You've just touched on this a little bit, but I'm really interested in sort of the question of like the oral history of food and how recipes and foodways are sort of passed down when people are working side by side in the kitchen. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of those kinds of like oral traditions when it comes to Southern food and Southern Jewish food.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating process. I'm just reading now a manuscript that Rachel Barnett and Lisa Harvey have written called Kugels and Collards, which will be published by the University of South Carolina Press in the next couple of years. And it's their oral history project across South Carolina with men, women, different generations of people. And it's been powerful to reconnect with those stories of many people across one state. And here again and again, they would capture, this recipe was never written down. Or my mother, everyone thought this was my mother's chopped liver. It wasn't. It was Florida greens. And Florida was an African-American cook who cooked for the family and kept, it was a kosher household. So you see these dynamics in really powerful ways, but that is how food knowledge is often passed. In just kind of the basic folkloric process is from one generation to the next. And by there's in Rachel and Lisa's book, there's a lot of watch me, a lot of mothers saying, you need to learn this, you need to watch me. And I'm hoping, I know that still happens. I have a beautiful little 19-month-old step granddaughter, Fiona, and we just got her a little high bench for pushing up to the kitchen island. And she, is just watching and saying everything, and so that process has to continue. And despite the internet and, a million recipes online and everything, I think we still go back to, particularly, I think within the Jewish South, or at least from what I studied, we go back to those community spiral bound cookbooks. A lot of my scholarship looked at when I sent around this crazy survey when I was doing my thesis, my dissertation, to like 400 Jewish women or something, and a lot of them responded, thankfully. And many of them had their own family, spiral bound cookbooks they did themselves. And a lot of people are doing that today. And those are just precious documents. or women had kept scrapbook journals, which I even kind of have my own version of a notebook, particularly during the pandemic, that I put together of all my favorite recipes I've been using, during kind of lockdown and then after. And that still exists. So those are really important sources. And then today, now there's a whole, like just this morning there's a whole genre of kind of contemporary Jewish American food writing that's really expanded what we think about when we say cookbook. I mean, because they're not just a collection of recipes, they are deeply researched, involved. They're just, there's a whole another level, I think, of the work that Leah Koenig is doing, just modern Jewish cooking, the Jewish cookbook. These are incredible texts that I keep mixed in with, they're all part of my scholarly collection.
You have kind of touched on this part of this kind of Southern Jewish story, but something that I think I've been thinking about a lot, and that really comes out in your work, is that race is such a big part of this story. That there's, of course, Southern foodways are so connected to African and African American food traditions. And then there's also this whole history of Jewish families having Black domestic workers who would cook both Southern and Jewish food for them. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that connection and kind of how that plays a role in this world.
Yeah, it's central, and maybe that's because you cannot talk about the South, you cannot talk about America without understanding race, right? So I knew that was critical, and like if I was to rewrite Matzo ball gumbo, I would say that, whereas I might have only kind of saw it at the time. I knew race was very important, and the fear of anti-Semitism and white supremacy, and how it shaped how Jewish Southerners began to act and even probably eat in particular communities where they felt really threatened. Like I'm thinking Atlanta and the trial of Leo Frank and his lynching and that trial. But in Matzo ball gumbo, I kind of went down it was about where we saw race was African American and Jewish women, Southern Jewish women's relationships in the home. And that's really, really important, but it's so much bigger because they were all players within this racialized landscape of the American South. So you can't talk about our foodways, Southern foodways, in any kind of immigrant foodways, Europe, African American foodways, European immigrants, Asian immigrants, anybody, today, Latinx, without really understanding the kind of racial foundations to capitalism, to the in the South, to the agricultural foundations of our region. And Southern Jews mirrored that racial etiquette, absolutely, and the racism and the politics, and it just was the water in which they swam. And and that's why it's still really critical to today, particularly, and like you can really see this in the great new work of young Black scholars and food historians, kind of within African American foodways in our country. But like for us in the South, that would be the work of Michael Twitty. Michael's got a really exciting new book coming out called Kosher Soul, which is focused on the Jewish South and the African American South, and that intersection. And I think that is going to be a really important place he's going to take us to a different moment in understanding. He wrote, for folks that are familiar with Michael's work, he wrote The Cooking Gene, and also, sorry, this is all looks back at Rice, a volume on rice, which is fantastic, published by UNC Press, as part of the Savor the South study. And his work is amazing.
I agree. All of this, I think, gets us to this interesting. Oh,
yeah, we were talking about the Jewish Farmers Network, and Michael's going to be the keynote for their upcoming conference. Yeah, which is soon. Like, is it in January or February?
Yes, I think it's the end of this week and next week. Yes.
Yeah, 2 weekends coming up. Jewish Farmers Network, that online conference is very, very good. Yes,
to everyone watching, I will put a link to that in the description of this video and in the comments on the Facebook page. All of this, I think, gets us to this dynamic that you write about that I'm really fascinated by, about kind of the distinctions and the connections between public and private life for Southern Jews as it relates to food, right? Like Jews making food choices to signal Southernness, but then also sort of showcasing Jewish traditions. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how food is kind of like a signifier or a way of displaying or celebrating Southern and Jewish identities.
Yeah, it really is. And again, I'm thinking about the Kugels and Collards project, even just the name of it, right? That in South Carolina, for them, that's what it looked like, was being able to have your mother's kugel, on Shabbat, or on Jewish holidays, but then you were deeply Southern if you eat collards. If you when they're in season, when you see them at the grocery store, the big bunches of collards, or you're going to make black-eyed peas, as people around the world have, made some kind of a pea or a bean like that predicted, that was supposed to bring good luck. You were going to do that on New Year's, and then but you were going to also have Hoppin' John in South Carolina, rice and some kind of field pea mixed together, and so I think I really see that in this work, and I saw it when I was doing my work, that it really depends upon your family of how that gets expressed. For some families, it was very mixed and integrated, like your Southernness happened and flowed and just kind of mixed in with your kind of your Jewishness in your cooking as well. And for other people, they were very separate worlds. And it also is so different generationally, because when we think about like the Jewish South, say, when there were more small Southern Jewish food entrepreneurs, I mean, we now are having this kind of rebirth and renaissance of Jewish food makers and creators and chefs. We could talk about that in a second, but back in the day, like in the 1930s and the 1940s, up to maybe the 1950s, there's a great story in Rachel and Lisa's work about it was in Mott's Gumbo too, of how the Lash family and the kosher butcher daughter or son marries the kosher baker's, those two came together, and that was very exciting. But there used to be those businesses supporting an active, observant Jewish community, and the bigger Jewish community. And that was a public space. So Jews were very present and public in that space. And then those kind of disappear with big corporate grocery stores. And we start to see kosher or few matzah boxes kind of get pushed into the ethnic aisle. But, I think temple bazaars, food bazaars have always been a performance of a safe performance, or up to now, when as the synagogue is increasingly a more fraught and dangerous place these days. But it was a place to invite the non-Jewish community to and welcome them through food. And the South Carolina State Fair, the Jewish Women of Columbia maybe even had a booth, a Jewish food booth at the fair. And I just and that story is fantastic. They talk about how the carnival workers, who were often Jewish, and traveling with the carnivals, loved the deli food. It was, and I just never had heard of that. I just thought that was fascinating. So there's a very private world of Jewish food within the home, and also kind of within the synagogue when we're just there as Jewish families, and then there's a more public interface that happens. And then, does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think too. Yeah. That's all. I'll stop for a second.
Well, you were just getting to this, and you and I were talking about this recently, is that there suddenly is this sort of like renaissance of Jewish food businesses, that kind of like the millennial generation is starting to open these Jewish food businesses across the South. Can you talk about kind of what that landscape looks like now?
Yeah, it's really exciting, and I've just seen it really blossom and grow, and that's really important in the landscape that we're in too right now, kind of in the racially divisive space that we're in. We didn't talk before too much when we were talking about race, about as when you look at Southern Jewish history and you look at like the Leo Frank trial, that heightened moment of white nationalism and white supremacy, and in a very destabilized society in the early 20th century. And you can really see those connections to where we are today, the rise in white nationalism, the growth of the heightened anti-Semitism. So when you see young people who can kind of openly express their Jewishness and open a Jewish delicatessen, or just their Jewish identity is a critical part, or the Jewish aspect of the food that they are selling or serving is, they celebrate it. That's a big deal to me. I think that's really, really important. I'm seeing a lot in North Carolina. One of my favorite Jewish food makers is Jennifer Lapidus, who owns Carolina Ground. And I know you're familiar with it, Nora, or you've bought some of their flour.
I have some whole wheat and rye in the kitchen, just to my right.
Amazing. So that she is a huge innovator. She grew up in Miami, Jewish Miami. Her grandfather, Morris Lapidus, was a great contemporary Miami architect. And she kind of went back to the land, was very interested in baking, agriculture. She ends up in Western North Carolina, back in the 80s, I guess, and ends up becoming a miller. It's so fascinating. It's, and I know there have been Jewish millers, but probably like in Europe. And so that business, Carolina Ground, now makes a connection between farmers, chefs, and a miller, providing a miller again. And that's, I love her work. I think it's really exciting. And there's a new deli that's going to be hopefully having a brick and mortar space called Meshuggah in Charlotte. Rob Clement has started that, and they're doing wonderful things. I love a group, a new bagel makers that have been around for a little bit in Raleigh called Bench Warmers Bagels, and they sprang out of Bolted Bread, which is a really fine artisanal bakery in Raleigh. So you see these kind of generating of but it's like some of the best bagels I've ever had, and they're using fresh milled grains. I'm sure they're probably getting their grain milled from Carolina ground. They're used, heirloom grains. They're pre-fermenting the grain and wood firing the bagels. I mean, it's like we could be in a small shtetl, so it's exciting. And then there's Matt Fern is a friend of mine. He opened a delicatessen called Ish. I love that, Ish, like Jew-ish, in Raleigh. And I love that name. It's great. And then of course there's Alon Shaya, who's a great, leader in New Orleans, chef who's now really expanded beyond New Orleans, but his restaurants, initially Shaya, then Saba, which are a great representation of a mix of the flavors of Louisiana, of New Orleans, but then of the diaspora of Sephardic, of Ashkenazic, of Mizrahi, foods all shared together.
I feel like this dovetails really nicely with a conversation that you and I were having about kind of the growth of the farm to table movement and the back to the land movement, and how that shows up in the South and how Jews are involved in that.
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting things I think that's happening is this new Jewish food movement. And it back a few years ago, like in class, we'd be like, oh, young Jewish people are really interested in the environment, and there was that connection. And then, and you just saw a lot more activism, I would encourage, my students who were interested in continuing to work in Jewish life, who didn't necessarily want work in Jewish institutions, religious institutions, look at the environment, because that seemed like an exciting place. But today that really does intersect with hunger, work and hunger, with food justice, sustainability, and agriculture. And that's a good example would be the Jewish Farmers Network that was started by a former student of mine, S.J. Selden and Shani Mink. And it's kind of now national, but still deeply rooted in North Carolina. But it's an interest in faith and justice and, kind of the religious calendar, the ancient religious calendar, environmentalism, and yeah, I hope I said sustainability, that's huge. But drawing on like Jewish religious traditions and values. And a scholar that's written on that is Dr. Adrienne Krohn, who I think we looked up. She's at Allegheny University. Her work is really, really interesting. So there's many groups across the country, that folks probably know, Hazon and Mazon, that are doing food related work. But it's really powerful. And then, I look, at like the Institute for Southern Jewish Life, and even now, like the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, y'all really see, food and a food as a lens is really a way that you guys are also definitely exploring the Jewish South, and that continues.
I'm so interested in how your career has really intersected with the growth of food studies as a discipline, but also that you have really gotten to witness the growth of Jewish studies programs at Southern universities. And I'm hoping you can talk about kind of how that has evolved and grown in the past few decades.
Yeah, that that is amazing, and I'm glad to have witnessed both. When we were just getting started at the Institute for Southern Jewish Life and even the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, we were strongly connecting to Jewish studies at Tulane, and at the time, and now, you know, because I felt like we really needed institutional partners, and especially tied to academia. And now the Jewish Studies program at Tulane has certainly taken off and power, always has. Michael Cohen's worked there. I was privileged to participate a few years ago, right before the pandemic, in a National Endowment for the Humanities Institute that went on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, for 20 scholars from across the university. Professors came in to take an institute on Southern Jewish life that Dale Rosengarten organized at the College of Charleston with Michael Cohen from Tulane. And that brought in incredible scholars on the Jewish South and then on American Jewish experience as well. Jonathan Sarna was there, Jenna Joslick was there, and many others. But that, and you can go online still and see that curriculum, see the syllabus, which I use all the time now still for putting together my work, my syllabi. It's really helpful to look at I can't remember the name of it, Privilege and something, or I can't remember the institute. I might have written it down. Anyway, but you can Google, we'll put a link to that as well. And you can also see the scholarly projects that those 20 professors and educators developed, which are fascinating. But when I started teaching at the University of North Carolina, it was just as our Jewish Studies program was being founded. So it was established in 2003, and I started here in about 2002. And it now has more than 20 faculty members who live and teach within other departments around the university. It's interdisciplinary, and then there is, you know, and then so it's actually housed within, you know, the degree is housed within religious studies, but the faculty come from all different departments, and so do the graduate students. There's 20 graduate students. You know, Josh Parshall, who's the historian for the Institute, he did his doctorate at UNC in American Studies, but was very much connected also to the Jewish Studies program here. So that was begun. Its first director was Jonathan Hess of blessed memory, who died way too young and just was an incredible leader in kicking that program off. And Ruth von Berneth is the exiting director of the program, and that's just been amazing to watch. But you know, I think of what Eric Goldstein's doing at Emory in their Jewish Studies program. It's amazing. At UVA, many Jewish Studies faculty in the UVA Jewish Studies program, and more. University of South Carolina. Which other ones? I mean, Elon, Guilford here in our state. All the other campuses around, all the other UNC campuses around the state also have at least a Jewish Studies faculty member.
Yeah, I'm always sort of astonished at what an incredible network of scholars there is doing this work.
Yeah, and I think you and I are both seeing the number, a younger contemporary generation who are now kind of standing on the shoulders of the founding generation of the Southern, and on the next generation of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. And the last conference that we just had, that was virtual again, but was amazing to see that mix of voices and of non-Jewish scholars an archivist who at the University of Kentucky who are building incredible archives for the study of Jewish Kentucky.
I love this because it's giving, I feel like I'm getting so many ideas for future virtual vacation episodes and also previewing ones that are already hopefully in the works. But I'm hoping that you can talk to us about your newest book project, Edible North Carolina, and talk about the book and sort of the process of putting it together.
Yeah. So I taught a class for a few years at Carolina that eventually focused in on North Carolina, on its foodways and culture. And we sent students across the state, or at least as far as they could get their bodies to do oral histories with folks working in the really diverse food landscapes of this place. And all out of that, the team I worked with, we hoped a book would come out of that about North Carolina foodways. And that's what this Edible North Carolina Journey Across the State of Flavor is. It's edited by me and by Casey Highsmith, who is a terrific partner and colleague of mine. She is a doctoral student in American Studies, and we've done this together. And the photography is by Baxter Miller and her partner Ryan Stansel, and they ran across the entire state during the pandemic. They are great documentation folks, documentarians, and of this state. They're both from here, but it includes 20 essayists, writers, farmers, fishermen, journalists, who are talking about the contemporary food landscapes of North Carolina. From kind of the what's happening with pigs and pig and barbecue in the state today, and the essay by Andrea Weigel looks at pasture-raised pork movement in our state versus the industrial pork in the state, which is huge. So we've got a couple of essays on kind of Latinx voices and issues in the state, and Asian American mom and pop Asian restaurants across the state, which most everybody is really familiar with their favorite kind of Asian American restaurant, and learning like who those people are. When did they, like their immigrant story? What region of China did they come from to North Carolina, and when and how and why food? And so thanks for asking. It's a powerful lens. Again, I just see it as a powerful lens onto kind of contemporary issues, really substantive issues across the state. And food is one way of understanding, how people are coping and thriving at this moment.
Speaking of coping and thriving, you've given me a really excellent segue, which is early on in our conversation, you were talking about how you've been keeping the recipes that you've been coming back to again and again during the pandemic. And I'm wondering what role food and cooking have served for you during this time.
Oh, it's been very powerful to see people suddenly in our community and across the country waking up to the power of local food during the pandemic, because those industrial and national and global pipelines of production, as we're still seeing today, shut down. But I mean, you remember when cars were backed up around, and waiting for food boxes, for sacks of food at the beginning of the pandemic, as grocery shelves emptied and people couldn't get meat, and or fresh vegetables. And, a good friend of mine who's a farmer here says that folks on her out where she lives in the county here said to her suddenly, "Oh, that's what you do. Yeah, that would be good." So I think a lot of, I've been thrilled to see how local food economies they're under terrible pressure and stress, but they have so risen to the moment. And thank goodness from the Biden administration, have received some support in the infrastructure bills that were passed earlier in the spring. But it gives me I think this might be a turning point, hopefully, in our country, maybe that we see the importance of having that local food infrastructure that's not so dependent upon, your food coming from California. And then probably I'm the same way as everybody else. Days can get a little dreary, particularly at this moment of as Omicron still holds on. And so Bill, my husband, has an office down the other end of the house, and we're just like, I'm like, it's lunch, some joy. So or like dinner, I'm a little tired, like way past tired of lentils maybe, but I'm so thankful for the community supported agriculture, 10 Mothers Farm, the farm box that we are privileged to pick up each week with my fresh vegetables, and and it's got a loaf of bread in it from Bolted Bread in Raleigh, and it's the thing that gives us some joy and hope and nourishment mentally and bodily these days.
Marcie, I want to ask you some questions from our wonderful viewers. This is a reminder to our viewers that if you have a question in these last few minutes with Marcie, please put it in the comments. We'd be thrilled to talk about it. Beth asks, from a parent of young kids, what's your favorite join in on making it easy recipe, food story, or way to excite kids in the kitchen? And she, in parentheses, says, Fiona's top pick.
That's so great. I'm telling you, Fiona loves her some grits. She really does. We often do, during the pandemic, like grain bowls have been really a thing at our table. And so she loves grits with, if I do really, it sounds crazy, black-eyed peas. She loves those. She loves greens as well. And I think, what else? Oh, and this is my southern part, shellfish, like a shrimp and grits kind of thing, or you could do a little roasted fish, with grits or salmon, and that's fabulous. And I think kids kind of love that. I think that is like my go-to kid beloved dish, I think. But we do a lot of like a coleslaw. Kids love a coleslaw often. You can do it a little you can do and make it really bright, like a purple cabbage and some dried cranberries and a purple onion and apple, and add a little honey and olive oil and mustard and dressing, and it's pretty delicious. But Fiona is just like a matzo ball, a knish. If we do deli for her, she's just like, bring it on. She can't get enough. So something she knows. She does know how. I don't know.
I feel her on the knish. My grandmother lives in Florida, and prior to the pandemic, when I would fly to visit her, I would always go get the best knishes in Florida, my personal item on the airplane would just be a bag of knishes.
Yeah, right.
We also have a question from my wonderful mother who is watching, from whom I
Oh.
get a lot of my family food traditions and love of food. And she asks, what could you do to modify quote unquote Northern Jewish recipes to make them more Southern? How do we add Southernness into kind of like traditional Jewish foods?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. And it's ingredients. Yeah, for sure. I know I was just thinking the other thing Fiona loves, and that is a good example of what your mom is asking about, is kugel. I mean, what little kids don't love kugel too, especially like kind of a sweet kugel or a savory kugel, a potato kugel. They love that. And it's easy for them to stir that stuff up if you get them up, on your, where they can stir on the island. We made kugels at the Lantern restaurant for the Kitchen Patrol program they do with little after school kids, underserved kids, before the pandemic. And I had like 25 kids learning about American and Southern Jewish foodways, and they made kugel and they just went kind of insane because they just thought it was so good. But you could add pecans to that. You can add any kind of a Southern ingredient, will Southernize, a great Jewish dish. And, I do add greens to like a mushroom barley soup. How can you not add greens to it? It's just a fabulous thing. This time of year, I just chop up my kale or collards or mustard greens and add them to a soup like that. Not so much chicken soup, but a vegetable barley kind of soup. And then of course sweet potatoes that if you're not making sweet potato latkes, you got to do it. They're delicious. And so North Carolina sweet potatoes is one of the biggest sweet potato growing states, but apples grated and sweet potatoes, that's a great one. You can make great sweet potato kugel. You can make a sweet potato bread. You can add sweet potato to challah, Oh, and then, barbecue. I mean, there's barbecue brisket. Kelly, my colleague and friend, Kelly Alexander, makes a great barbecue brisket.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation right before I'm going to have lunch. That would be, it's very good. Sophie asks, how do climate change and agricultural issues affect Southern Jewish foodways and the types of dishes we will be able to eat or not in the future?
Well, geez, it's going to affect Southern Jewish foodways in the same way it's affecting all of how we eat. And I know that our farmers here are just seeing, very different climate conditions, and, what used to be grown, south of us, we can now grow that here. So I just think that it's very much going to impact how we're all eating. And, I think it's just critically important to be as aware of climate change and as supportive as you can of your food producers, and do what you can to support those local food economies. Certainly we've seen it in this state personally with the extreme storms and hurricanes that we've had hit the North Carolina coast. And then in rapid succession, there's probably been 4 or 5 in the last few years that have been devastating. And that impact, that then will ripple out and it'll affect food availability across the state in really powerful ways. So I think if you want to support climate change, initiatives, then we need to do everything we can to support Biden and passing those and adding that work back in, and then also supporting just buy local.
I love to end on a call to action. Marcie, thank you so much for joining me this morning and talking about your incredible work. It was such a pleasure to talk with you and have you be a part of this series. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Nora, I'm so grateful for your work and everything you're doing. I think your work is incredible. And I thank you for your leadership and for having a chat with me. It's such a treat.
Thank you so much. As a reminder to everyone watching, you can learn more about Marcie and her work and her career on her website, marciecohenferris.com. You can also pre-order a copy of Edible North Carolina, which you should absolutely do. And again, the links to that and many other things that we've chatted about will be in the description of the video and in the comments, so you can come back to them later. I want to thank our wonderful viewers and the ISJL team for their continued support of the ISJL Virtual Vacation. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I also hope that you will join the ISJL Virtual Vacation for our next episode, which comes out on Tuesday, February 22nd at 11 a.m. Central Time. That episode is called Southern Jewish Romance. It'll be an in-depth analysis of the ways in which Southern and American Jews have invested in rituals and practices that connect young Jews to each other, as well as a reflection on sort of the diversity of Southern Jewish love stories, past and present. And if you have a Southern Jewish romance that you would like to share, wonderful viewers who are watching this, I hope that you will shoot an email at heritage@isjl.org. You can also learn more about the ISJL Virtual Vacation, sign up for our monthly updates, and watch all of our past episodes, including this one coming up later today, on our website, isjl.org/virtual-vacation. And we will see you next month for more stories from the Jewish South. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nora.